go teach a class in Israel and Palestine.
That's what it says.
And theological issues related to it.
Preacher.
So last week we had some introductions, a little backstory, and Mike got us started with the story of the conflict leading up to 1948 and the War of Independence, and that's where we're going to pick up today. Then next week, I'm going to be talking with you about the biblical aspect of it. What does the Bible say about the land and who it belongs to, and about prophecy and so on. But tonight, Michael's going to, he is going to take what we do in 4 lectures, good in one, three lectures maybe in good in one. So we're going to take a run through the history of this conflict from 1948 to the present. Cut out a lot of stuff. We may come back this fall if y'all are interested in doing the longer version of this class. We do this in churches. We usually take 8 to 10 weeks. That's what we're doing in 3 this time. But that's what we're doing. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about. It's not going to be much Bible tonight. Maybe not any. It's just the story of what's happened and how did we get where we are. Kind of ending with the controversy over the embassy of Jerusalem. So we want to know what all the controversy is about the embassy tonight. The class will help explain some of the backstory to that, about how we got where we are. So,
can you briefly recap what we did last time, because it's not.
I'm having trouble with the PowerPoint, so while they're getting the PowerPoint out, we'll do a quick recap. So one of the things we talked about last week is that there is a way of thinking about this this subject among Christians today in America. It's actually a new way of thinking about the Bible. Today, in lots of evangelical churches, people just kind of assume that God gave the land to Israel forever, so it must belong to the Jewish people today. But that's actually a new way of reading the Bible. That really only became popular in America in the last probably 50, 75 years. And as a way of reading biblical prophecy, it's only about 150 years old, something like that. Historically, Christians didn't view Scripture that way. We're going to talk about that next week. We'll talk about what did Scripture say, what did the prophets say, how do we understand prophecy, and how the Christians understood that. So
do you have an HDMI thing I can just plug my laptop into?
Then, toward the end of class last time, Michael got us started with the fact that the Jews were kicked out of the land of Israel by the Romans. And actually in 63 BC, the Romans took over the land of what they then called, the Romans called Palestine. They kicked the Israelites out, or kicked the Jews out in 70 AD and 135 AD. They kind of pushed the rest of them out. Between 63 BC and when they kicked them out in 70 AD, Israel was controlled by the Romans. That's the period we're reading about mostly in the New Testament era. So subject of that empire. From the time the Romans kicked the Jews out, the land has been controlled by one empire after another for 2,000 years. But there were people living there, living in the land. We call them the Palestinians, the Arab people who lived there for centuries. Christians, thousands of Christians.
Bring me his remote.
Cities like Nazareth,
Get the remote from him.
Majority of Christian cities. Much of the rest of the population was Muslim. There was a small population of Jews that lived there all through this period. And most of that time, the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims lived together in peace until Christians started persecuting Jews in Europe in the late 1800s. And Jews began to come to Palestine, wanting to have a homeland, a safe place, and they said, let's go back to where our ancestors lived,
This is really weird, guys.
And the Arabs said, wait a minute, this is our home. We work these fields, we keep these olive trees, this is where we live.
Why is it going blank?
And so the conflict began to arise. And then the Holocaust hit, and many, many more Jews began to come to the land. And the British were controlling the land, and the tensions began to rise, and that's, are we ready?
I got to see
we're almost there.
Just tell him to go twice.
Is it working?
You want this slide? For some reason it's blank, but I can do it here.
We mentioned last
There you
time,
go.
by way of introduction, my father was a Bible teacher.
Okay, the rest of them are working?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Something's wrong with that.
And was a noted archaeologist, and so my family began to travel there in the late 60s. And so his father, my brother, and I, got to make some trips as kids. And then our families continued to travel many times. And then Michael spent, one of the things that he did was spend a summer there working with Christian peacemaker teams in Hebron. And we might have a slide or two from Hebron today, will we?
Actually, I don't think I have anything in there. I had to cut hundreds of slides out of this presentation.
We'll say that when we come back. So I'm going to hand it over to Mike now, and we're going to do a fast run through the story of the conflict tonight. Mike?
Great. Is this a little loud? It feels maybe a little loud. Can we take the volume down a little bit on me? I feel like we're going to destroy the ears. Is this better? Test 1, 2. How we doing? Is this good? Okay, great. So sorry, we've lost about 10 minutes, so I may not be able to get through all of it. My goal was to try and get done about 10 minutes early so that I could hear any of your feedback or responses to this. So I'll go as quickly as I can, but I'm going to try and cover from 1948 until essentially modern day in the course of about 40 minutes. So you know that I'm going to be leaving a ton out, because that's the only way to do this. As I said, today I cut about 100 slides out of a normal presentation on this, so there's a ton of stuff that I'm not going to be able to tell you. But just to give you a good sense of the overview. So where we left off last time was we had talked about the rise of political Zionism in the late 1800s. Anti-Semitism was rampant in Europe. A guy named Theodor Herzl said, hey, we've been talking about going back to Palestine for a really long time. Let's actually do it. He writes a book. He starts a movement. Jews begin immigrating from Europe to return to Palestine, where they had been wanting to go for 2,000 years. And as they get there, many of the immigrants realize that the land was not as it had been told to them. And what had been told to them was that the land was empty and waiting for people to inhabit it. And the reality was it was very full of people. They were called Arabs, or now we refer to them as Palestinians, who were living in a place that was called Palestine at the time. And tensions began to develop between the immigrants and the people living there, especially when the immigrants that were moving there, what we call the Zionists, began buying up land and then denying the Arabs the right to work the land. Right, we talked about that last time. You had a case of immigrants coming in and taking jobs, and that was producing tension for the local inhabitants. So those tensions continued to rise. There were the World War I happened, the Ottoman Empire lost control over Palestine, British took over, there's all this exchanging of land and turning over of land and all this kind of stuff's going on. Until you get to World War II and the Holocaust happens, and that significantly increases the Jewish immigration to Palestine, because of course it would, right? They're trying to get out of Europe, many are going to the United States, many are going to other places in the world, and many come to Palestine. So, in February of 1947, Britain, who was in control of the land, said, we're done, we can't figure this out anymore, and they give the problem over Palestine over to the United Nations and say, you figure out how to divide this land between the Arabs and the Jews, we don't know what to do anymore, we're pulling out. And they do this because the significant increase in Jewish immigration from the Holocaust changed the demographics on the ground and fueled the tensions between the locals and the immigrants. So the United Nations in November of 47 decided to partition the land into what you can see on this map. I'll point over here for now. So what you can see in the light colors here, am I going in and out? Are y'all hearing me okay? Okay. What you can see in the light color here would be the new Jewish state. And what you would see in the dark color would be the new Arab state, with this middle little island, it looks like here, being international territory, and that would be Jerusalem and Bethlehem. Nobody would have control over that. Now, it's important to note that every partition plan, and what I mean by that is every plan that's been put forward on how to divide the land, has actually had Jerusalem being international neutral space. No plan has actually given control of Jerusalem to the Palestinians or to the Israelis, because it is the most holy city in the land, and the plans have said that needs to be what they call corpus separatum, a body set apart. Nobody gets it, and everybody gets it, is the idea. All the way back to 1936 was the first time they talked about this. And that had been the proposal until 2017 when President Donald Trump changed that. So it's just to say how long that had been the official kind of world policy. The UN resolution in 1947 suggested this as the partition plan, and it passed. I didn't know I had all those little things. Let me go back. Sorry. It passed, just going to do it again, with the United States voting in favor, all of the Arab states, voting against it, and then there were 13 nations that said, we're not even going to vote on it, including Great Britain, which I always love. That Britain had helped create all this problem, and they said, we're so done with it, we're not even going to vote on it. We're just getting out of this. But it did pass, this resolution, and it became, under international law, it became law. But one of the reasons that the Arabs were against this was because what happened was that it took the Jewish minority, which was absolutely the minority at the time, made up about 33% of the population, and it gave that minority the majority of the land. So overnight, the Jewish people went from being the 33% minority to owning 55% of the entire land, due to a decision by the United Nations. So it's not hard to imagine why the Jewish leadership would say, we'll take that land, and why the Arab leadership would say, no way. Because why would they agree to that, right? They're losing half the land overnight by a vote for people who were based in, elsewhere in the world. And the reason why it was divided up this way, in short, would be what you can see in red just briefly was where most of the immigrants were settling. So you can see that it is in consistency with the way they drew the map. It was just, they drew the map based on where the Jews were living at the time. And you probably can't tell this from these maps, but if you look up in the region that went to the Jewish state, can you notice anything about it? It's green. So there's another reason why the Arabs weren't in favor is the Jewish people got the best part of the land. And that's partly why they were settling where they were, is because up in the Galilee and along the coast was the best farming land. So it's just to give you, so the way the story often gets told is, there was a chance for peace, and the Jews said yes, and the Arabs said no, and it gets left at that. But it's a little bit more complicated than that, just to see why would they have turned down the chance to have an Arab state. Well, they would have turned it down because they were the majority population who were offered the minority piece of the land, and they were offered the piece of land that wasn't as good as the other one. So it's a pretty reasonable reason to say no to a deal. Now, it doesn't work out in their favor in the end, right? They lose even more land over and over again. They keep hoping for a better deal, and it never happens. They never get the deal that they're wanting. But it's not, to me, it's not hard to understand why at that time they would have said, that's not a deal that we're willing to go for. So, the British have been in control, they give it to the UN, and they officially say that we are withdrawing all of our presence there, and we'll do that on May 14th, 1948. And it's at that time, if you know anything about the history of Israel, that the state of Israel emerges and declares its independence. So May 14th, 1948, we now have the state of Israel under the leadership of Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, and the United States and the Soviet Union are both, they recognize Israel within about 20 minutes, which is really interesting, right? Because we're into the Cold War era now, and you can see already the U.S. and the Soviet Union are trying to jump in to see who's gonna be the first to recognize. So the very next day, May 14th, 1948, we have the state of Israel, and the very next day, the surrounding Arab nations invade this new state of Israel and go to war. Now, Israel will call this its war of independence, because it's fighting for its life, I would say, right? It's just established independence, it's now trying to keep that state, because all these surrounding Arab nations have attacked it. The Palestinians refer to this period as the Al-Nakba, which means in Arabic, the catastrophe. Usually in English, it's spelled N-A-K-B-A, you can see it up here. You won't be able to understand any of the history, really, in terms of, any of the current political situation in Israel and Palestine if you don't understand what this term is, the Nakba. So it's the catastrophe of the Palestinian people is the way they'll refer to it. And it's called the catastrophe because when this war happens, 750,000 Palestinians are driven from their homes or flee in the course of the war with hopes of coming back to their homes, and they have still to this day, 70 years later, never been able to come back. And so those refugees and their descendants, until the Syrians, were the largest refugee population in the world. So this was their big catastrophe, where they were in a place, they lost most of the land over partition plans, suddenly there was a war happening, and then 750,000 of them were displaced. Now, what's important is that one way to tell this story is that Israel declares its independence. The next day, the Arab nations want to kill them all. They start a war, and it's sad that it's just the result of a war that refugees were created. That's one way to tell the story. But there's perhaps a more truthful way to tell the story, which is that in the months leading up to the establishment of Israel, so before the war had ever started, there was and by the way, everything I'm about to say is well documented, and it comes from Israeli military archives. This isn't Palestinian propaganda. Every 50 years, Israel is required to release, as part of their law. They have no constitution, so it's not a constitutional law, but it's just part of their system of government. But every 50 years, they will release the military archives that they have. So they were established in 1948, so in 1998, they released their first set of military archives. And at that time, many of the Israeli historians realized that they had been telling the story wrong, because they began reading what the Israeli military had documented that they had done at the time of independence. So the historians began rewriting the history to be more accurate, and they're called the New Historians of Israel. And one of the big books that came out during that time was a book by an Israeli historian, Jewish-born in Israel, called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. Because what he did was he reread the history, reread the military archives, and said, actually, what we did was ethnically cleanse the land of Palestinians. That's the language that he felt was the most accurate way to describe what had happened. And the reason why he called it that is because in the months leading up to the establishment of Israel, the Zionist paramilitaries, what would become the Israeli army, the IDF, formed a plan to get rid of the Arab population that would remain within what would become the state of Israel. So when they divided up the land, there would still be portions of the Arab population that were in what would become the Jewish state, and they formulated a plan on how to get those people out so they would be almost exclusively Jewish. And so they began implementing that in the months before Israel became a state. So they started clearing particularly the coastal areas, and in many of these places it wasn't just moving people out, it was murdering them. So one of the most famous is a place called Deir Yassin, near Jerusalem, where 93 Palestinians were killed and buried in a mass grave. And this was happening in several other places as well. Again, very well documented. There are testimonies from Israeli soldiers that did this, that say we did this. So here's what's staggering to me is that between March 30th, for instance, and May 15th, and I put May 15th up there because that's the day that the war starts. So for the month preceding the actual beginning of the war, 200 Palestinian villages had been cleared already, and about 200,000 refugees had been created. So it's actually not entirely true to say, well, the Palestinians were just the Palestinian refugees are a tragic consequence of a war that the Arabs started. Many of them were a consequence of a war that was, yes, in a way, started by the Arabs. Many of them, 200,000, had already been displaced before the war ever began, due to specific, well-planned military strategies by the Zionist paramilitaries that would become the Israeli army. Was what I'm saying making clear? You can disagree with it, you can do your own research on it, but are you understanding what I'm saying? Okay.
One quick point about this that you didn't catch. Up until 98, most of this story was not known by Israelis. Israelis didn't know this about their own story, many of them. We would hear, while we were there, we would hear some stories about this from Arabs who had lived there, whose families had been through this, but you wondered, could you believe that? You know, was that propaganda? But so this was a story. This isn't like, oh, well, every Jew, everybody in Israel was a part of this. Most people didn't know it had happened.
Yeah. I don't think there's anything else I need to say about this. Some of the slides that I cut out were slides that had text from personal testimonies of soldiers at the time who were saying, this is in fact what we did. So I'm just asking you to take my word for it at the moment, and you can go do your own research later. So I have here a picture of a key, because this is one of the symbols of the Palestinian refugees, because many of them were told, there's a war coming, go ahead and leave, go to the hills, we'll fight this war and then you can come back. But they were never, so they locked their doors, left all their furniture and belongings and went to the hills, and they've been gone for 70 years and haven't been allowed to come back to their homes. Many of those homes were destroyed, and now new Jewish cities have been built on top. Other times, Jewish families just moved into those homes and they're still standing. But Palestinians have not been allowed to return to the homes that they lost during that period. So you can see here on this map, all those little black dots, just to give you a sense of scale, are all the Palestinian villages that were depopulated. That all the Palestinians in those cities were moved out during that war. You can see how many communities there are. I think the estimated number is 538. And in some ways, this is consistent with one of the quotes that I gave you before. Right? We shall try to spirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for them in the transit countries, so on and so forth. He says the expropriation of the poor must be carried out discreetly and circumspectly. And again, Herzl's original idea was we're going to do this through economic reasons, but essentially it ends up happening through force of arms. And you remember that King Crane Commission I told you about in 1919, where the American survey said it's not going to happen economically. The only way they're going to be able to do what they want to do in terms of moving out the Arab population is to do it through a war. And that's, in fact, what happens. I think I want to come back to that. Well, we'll go ahead. So David Ben-Gurion, he becomes the first prime minister of Israel. He says in 1937, which was when the first ever partition plan was put forward, that didn't work. But he says, after we constitute a large force following the establishment of the Jewish state, we'll cancel the partition and we'll expand to the whole country. All right, so this was an acknowledgement from the person who becomes essentially their president, right, to say, well, we're not going to actually abide by the partition that's given to us. We'll just cancel it and then we'll take the rest of the land. It's a footstep. You know, it's our first step in order to acquiring everything. Let's skip that one. So the war ends in 1949. Various ceasefires signed with different countries. Now it's important to know that what we talk about now with the borders, actually I think I have a map here. What we talk about now with the borders, what you can see here is the West Bank, and then Gaza, and this is Israel. These are not actual borders. There are no borders for Israel, because Israel has never in its history declared what its borders are, ever. So these are simply armistice lines. They're peace lines that have been in place since 1949, but Israel has never said our borders are these lines. So this is why one of the major issues that still have to be negotiated in peace accords between Israelis and Palestinians is what are the actual borders of the Israeli state, because at the moment they actually don't have them officially in the way that the United States has hard borders. Right? So you can see this map is showing what has happened to the Palestinian control or residence in the land. As it moved from all the dark that you see here before the partition plan of 1947 to what I showed you before, what they got from the UN, to then after the war, Israel conquered more of the land, and then the Palestinians were left with this from 1949 until 1967. That border, or that line, we called the Green Line because it originally was drawn in green. It's also called the 1967 border, meaning that that's the border that existed when the 1967 war happened, which I'll tell you about in a minute. But I'm only saying that to say that when you hear people talking about Israel-Palestine, and you hear them saying, we need a two-state solution based on the 1967 borders, or based on the Green Line border, they're referring to these boundaries as you see it in this map. Okay? So Israel would be what you see in white, and then Palestine would be what you see in green. That's what people are meaning when they say 67 borders, two-state solution. So here we've gotten to the first of what are called the 5 final status issues, meaning that these are the 5 major issues that Israelis and Palestinians say that they need to agree upon and negotiate in order to find some kind of political resolution. So the first, you can see we have refugees, settlements, borders, water, and Jerusalem. I'll come to all those hopefully in the course of the next 30 minutes. But you can see the first issue is refugees. Essentially, what happens to Palestinian refugees? Do they get to come home? Do they have to stay gone? Does Israel have to pay compensation to them? So that's the big piece of negotiation regarding the refugees. Sorry, I'm having trouble with this PowerPoint. Do you know why it's going black? I'm missing a bunch of stuff. Okay, hold on. Okay, this is, well, anyway, it's not, for some reason this isn't working very well. So what ends up happening is right after the armistice in 1949, the UN issues a resolution that says the Palestinian refugees should get to come back or you need to pay them compensation. Neither of those things have ever happened. That's the short of it. The very next year, Israel passes a law called the Law of Return that says any Jew anywhere in the world has the right to immigrate to Israel and become a citizen immediately. So from the Palestinian perspective, they're seeing, wait, so we were kicked off of our land and we're not allowed to return, but any Jew anywhere in the world is allowed to come here and make their home in the place where we once were. Where's the fairness in that? So that's part of the way that Palestinians would tell that story. So then you have a period of the Cold War. We usually spend a little bit of time on this. We're not going to be able to today. Essentially just to say this conflict gets fanned. The flames of it get fanned quite a bit during the Cold War because there's this African proverb that says when elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. And the elephants usually are fine, but the grass doesn't do so well. It's the same thing that really happened in the Cold War. Though you had this war in some ways between the US and the USSR, it was actually the rest of the world where that war got played out. Because they would end up kind of doing these mini wars all over the world, Central and South America, places in Africa and the Middle East, to see, hey, if you go to war, who would actually win? And so the US really began sending arms and increasing its alliance with Israel, and the Soviet Union was increasing its ties to the Palestinians, not because they specifically loved the Palestinians, but because the United States was on the other side of the conflict. The US had chosen Israel, so the Soviets chose the other side. It's pretty as simple as that. So that gets intensified. Then in 1964, the PLO, I'm sure everyone's heard of the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, that's when it comes onto the scene, 1964. Now, we usually don't do anything with this in a very short presentation, but I think it's really fascinating. And what I want to point out is just a few articles from what the PLO originally said it was meant to do. So the first thing it said was that Palestine should have never been divided. This whole UN division of the land, not legitimate, because we didn't agree to it, so it shouldn't have ever been divided. Palestine should be a single state, ruled by the Arabs. Not all that different from the Jewish claim that it should be a single Jewish state ruled by the Jews, right? So it's just different claims. But what's important, and that most of us probably don't know, is that when the PLO was founded, notice Article 7, Jews are most welcome if they live peacefully with us and are loyal to us. Loyal in the sense that they're loyal to the Arab state in which they would live. Again, not a different claim from Israel saying, well, Arabs can live here, but they have to swear allegiance to the Jewish state. It's the exact same claim, just on the other side. So, this is interesting because one of the ways we tell the stories is that the Palestinians from the get-go have been trying to kill all the Israelis. Well, I mean, according to this, that's not true. According to at least what the PLO said in its national charter, is to say, actually, you're welcome to be here, but you just have to be peaceful and you have to get in line with the Arab state of Palestine. And what they do go on to say is that what they're resisting is Zionism as a colonial movement. To say, we're not on board with being occupied, we're not on board with colonialism, we're not on board with displacement, and we will resist those things. We want to peacefully coexist, but we can never coexist with aggression or with occupation and colonialism. So that's the original language of the founding of the PLO. I think that's really fascinating. So, jump ahead a little bit farther. We have 1967. I'm sure many of you maybe remember when this happens. June of 1967, Israel claims that there is Egypt especially is about to go to war, about to invade, an attack is imminent, we have to do something. So Israel then launches preemptive strikes on the surrounding Arab nations and beats all of them, conquers them essentially in 6 days. So it's called the Six-Day War. And what's really important in terms of the history of Israel-Palestine is that at this time, Israel takes over almost all of the land within what we would call ancestral Palestine, the British Mandate. So between the end of the War of Independence and the Six-Day War, Israel had control of what you see in blue. Gaza and the Sinai were controlled by Egypt. The West Bank was controlled by Jordan, and the Golan Heights were part of Syria. Okay? Then in June of 1967, in the course of 6 days, Israel took all of that. And it's a really impressive military accomplishment. But they took Golan from Syria, the West Bank from Jordan, and Gaza and the Sinai from Egypt. Now, they eventually give the Sinai back in negotiations in 1979 as part of the Camp David Accords, brokered by Jimmy Carter. But Gaza they held control of, and they ended up building what we call settlements, which I'll tell you about soon. They built settlements there until 2005, and they ended their settlement program there. But this is where you're hearing about most of the clashes today, right? They're in Gaza. The West Bank, they have a full military occupation over. What that means is the military has control over most of the West Bank. Now, you may be in a position to say, but Israel has entitlement to the West Bank, so it's not occupation. But they do have military control. And we would have to agree on that. If you've been there, then you would see it. And then they've really kind of annexed the Golan Heights. They're trying to take that off of the table for discussions. They've got settlements up there. They've been drilling for oil there. They've even held parliament meetings in the Golan to try to normalize that. And in fact, there was just a report at about noon today, Israel claiming that they expect in the next few months that Donald Trump will also acknowledge the Golan Heights as part of Syria, which is another really contentious
It's part of Israel.
Sorry, what's that? Yeah, what did I say?
Syria.
Syria, part of Israel. Yeah, correct. So he went and said, I'm going to break with tradition and say that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, and then Israel is saying they expect he'll also break with tradition to say the Golan Heights is also part of Israel. Because until today, it's been contested territory, left to be negotiated, as opposed to being decided upon by the U.S. So this is a really significant period. This is when many Palestinians would say the occupation begins. That Israel takes over the Palestinian territories of the West Bank and Gaza and has continued to control those territories with its military. We're going to skip past this. At this point, we have the beginning of international consensus, really the first time that the world starts agreeing on something regarding this place. And what they agree on is that Israel needs to fully withdraw from all the territory that it took, and that the Arabs need to stop being so aggressive and sign a peace treaty. Okay, so that's where the consensus comes down. And it's been true until now. It's been the official United States position until now that Israel has no claim, legitimate claim, to the West Bank and Gaza, and that that land should be returned they should withdraw their forces from it. Obviously, Israel hasn't done it, but that has been the U.S. position. The U.S. has also not acted on it to try and make it happen, but it has been the official position. So there was a UN resolution that was issued in 1967, essentially saying you can't keep the land that you took. This is in consistency with the Geneva Accords. It said, you know what, for most of human history, we have expanded our empires by going to war with people and taking their land. We're done with that now. Our borders are what our borders are. So from now on, if a war happens and you find yourself in possession of more land, when the war is over, you give the land back. That's just now new world policy. And this is why what Israel's control over the West Bank and Gaza would be considered under international law illegal, because it was land acquired during the war that they're supposed to then withdraw from when the war ended, which was in 6 days. So Israel hasn't complied with that. Obviously, they still have control over it. Again, you may say it's legitimate control, but it's control that under the legal language of international law is not legitimate. We're going to skip this too. So what happens is that Israel now finds itself in control of all this extra land, and they got to figure out.
I just want to add one quick thing. There's an interesting thing that's developing at this time about the UN's role in the Middle East. We taught that earlier resolution said we're going to divide the land, and the Israelis said yes, and the Arabs said no. This resolution said Israel needs to give back this land they took in '67, and the Arabs said yes, we like that, and the Israelis said no. So each side has pointed to UN resolutions that support their side of the conflict. But internationally, what the world has said is that they accepted the division of the land in 1948, but they rejected the Israeli occupation in '67, and that's an important point in kind of getting your head around what's going on in the world stage.
Yeah, so for Palestinians, they would point to a contradiction to say, in 1947, the UN divided the land and gave the Jews a state. The Arabs didn't agree to, and everyone said that was legitimate. But then the United Nations in 2012 recognized Palestine as its own state, and many in the world said, well, you can't decide that unilaterally. And the Palestinians are like, wait, but you did in '47, and somehow that's stuck. So why do you get to decide that we're supposed to recognize Israel as a state, but we don't get to recognize that Palestine gets to have a state? Where's the consistency? So that would be part of the way that they would articulate that. So in 1967, Israel takes the West Bank, Gaza, and Golan. And what I had up there were slides of minutes of the cabinet meetings within Israel immediately following the war, saying, what are we going to do with all the land we've just taken? And kind of all these different propositions that was with it, but I'm going to have to skip it. But what they ended up deciding to do is to begin building what we call settlements. So settlements, another one of the final status issues, and they refer to Israeli Jewish housing units, cities, towns, villages, that are built on the land that Israel conquered in 1967. Okay, so for instance, Tel Aviv would not be considered a settlement. It's within the state of Israel. But Ma'ale Adumim, which is near Bethlehem, would be considered a settlement because it's on the other side of the Green Line, the other side of the 1967 border, the other side of the Armistice Line. Does that make sense, what it means what the language of settlement means? So any Israeli city or town that is built in what would be called the Palestinian territories, or the land that was conquered in '67, is referred to as a settlement. And again, those are also under international law considered illegal. because you're not allowed as an occupying power to transfer your population into the territories that you've taken during the war. So the way that, let me go back, the way that the settlements are built, actually I don't have time for that. Just to say that you can see here, here's an overview of one of the settlements kind of sprawling along the hillsides. So there's not just like little tiny communities of a few hundred people. Some of these settlements have 60,000 people in them. Universities, they have elected mayors, they have hospitals. It's full-on city. So at the, let's skip ahead. This is a settlement called Har Homa. Just, sorry, you're not looking that way. This is a settlement called Har Homa. Just over here is, you can see just the very edge of Bethlehem. So Jerusalem is behind me. This was a Palestinian hillside, but then after 67, when Israel conquered the land, they began building this settlement. This is now exclusively a Jewish city. No Arab can live in here. And here would be Bethlehem, so you can see how close they are to each other. And so, to this day, approximately 590,000 Israeli citizens, or settlers, are living inside the Palestinian territories in these settlements, over in about 127 settlements. So this, many would say, this is in fact the #1 obstacle to getting a two-state solution. Because the question is, how would the Palestinians create their state when they could have over 500,000 Israeli citizens living there who arguably would never agree to be Palestinian citizens? How are you going to do that? What are we going to do with all the Israeli citizens that now live in what would be Palestine under a two-state solution? It's very, very complicated. And many analysts, including the Israeli analysts, would say it is this fact here, what they call the facts on the ground, that have potentially effectively killed the two-state solution. So many now would say they really have no chance of there ever being an Israel and a Palestine side by side, primarily because of this. We're now looking at a single-state solution, which, just a little teaser, is really potentially bad news for Israel. And I'll tell you about that later. It's not a good option for a Jewish state for it to be a single-state solution. So I just want to pique your interest, and I'll come back and explain that in a minute. So they began building these settlements. You can see, it's hard to tell on these maps, but everything that you see in red or pink, these are all settlements all throughout the West Bank. So you can see they go almost all the way over to Jordan. So it's not just stuff right around the border. Right in the heart of the West Bank, you can see that there are these Israeli settlements. That's just making the case for why it's against international law. The other way that Israel decides to solidify its control of the land, one is to build settlements, and the other is to start destroying Palestinian homes. So between these, this is documented by the UN, between 1967 and 1971, Israel destroyed approximately 16,000 Palestinian homes, bulldozed them, and moved those Palestinians out in order to make more room to build the settlements. In well-documented stats. This is an example. So there was a lively Palestinian community that lived right up against the Western Wall. Sorry, I keep pointing for here. Y'all can't see that. Against the Western Wall. So if you've ever been to Jerusalem, you will have been here, I'm sure. There's a beautiful, large, sweeping plaza there now that you can go and visit and pray if you wish at the Western Wall. But up until 1967, there were Palestinian homes almost all the way up into this wall. I mean, Jews still prayed there. But there was, in fact, we have a good friend named Mahmoud who was born in one of those houses. But then in 67, when Israel conquered the land, they bulldozed all those Palestinian homes and made way to build this big plaza that you can visit now. So it's very interesting when you go there, because you go and you experience this beautiful plaza and you have this wonderful moment, but you also hold this awareness that there was an entire community that was living on the very place where you're standing, that was made to move out. And it's black again. Sorry folks, I don't know what's happening. All right, so let me see where I was. So, is it back? All right, it's frustrating.
Hey Michael, stop pushing the button.
Don't push this, okay?
Yeah. Give us a second to catch up.
I can probably do most of this from memory, but you'll follow along a lot better if you can see the pictures. Anyway, so, yeah, the other way. So after this period, there's a charter from the Palestinian National Council that is changing its language a little bit. So it was saying, you know what, we're looking for peaceful coexistence. You know, We will welcome the Jews to be here, welcoming and peaceful, or in a peaceful and loyal manner. And now, after the occupation started in '67, the language changes, and it says, you know what? We're gonna talk a little bit differently now. Armed revolution is now the only way to liberate Palestine. You know, we were trying it through a different way. It's not going to work. It's now all about war. And so, right from this point, from 1968 on, is when you start seeing the rise of Palestinian terrorism. So many of you will remember airplane hijackings, I'm sure, back in the 60s and 70s. You'll remember in 1972, the kidnapping of the Israeli athletes at Munich, the Munich Olympics. Yeah, you can just leave it there, thank you. You know, there was the Black September killing, the Japanese Red Army terrorists massacred civilians at Tel Aviv Airport, also in 1972. And so you really see this change of tactics for Palestinians. It would be untrue to say that Palestinians were engaged in acts of terrorism from the time of Israel's establishment. That's not the way the history went. What we would call terrorism, hijacking airplanes, kidnappings and murders, suicide bombings haven't come in yet. But those types of things, the bombing of planes, all that stuff, that begins to happen after the Six-Day War, when Palestinians had lost a lot of land, and now all of a sudden what they had left was conquered again, and they said, you know what, we're going all out with this. And we're going to try and get back everything that's been taken from us. Obviously it doesn't work, but that was the strategy. So there's a series of wars that we're not going to go into. There's a peace accord over the next few years between Israel and Egypt, called the Camp David Accords. Israel invades Lebanon to attack the PLO. Tensions continue to rise from 1967 to 1987. Can you go to the next slide, please? So there is a, I don't know what's going on. So there's a, in 1987, after 20 years of trying this violent Arab revolutionary, what we might call terrorism approach, the first intifada starts. An intifada is an Arabic word meaning shaking off. So it's what we refer to as the uprising, Palestinian uprisings, where they say we're going to try and shake off the Israeli control of Palestinian territories. So this starts in the end of 1987, and it is primarily an unarmed, not necessarily non-violent, but primarily unarmed revolution that is marked particularly by acts of civil disobedience. If you go ahead and just move forward a few. So you can see here there were calls for general civil disobedience, boycotts, deal a blow to the economy, stop working in the settlements, you know, have a general strike, a go slow strike, abstain from paying taxes, don't pay fines, boycott Israeli goods. So that was their strategy, was to say, you know what, instead of continuing this violent revolution, let's change tactics, and we will force Israel to come to the table and negotiate with us because we'll cripple their economy. And it works, because they get Israel to the table, and then what happens in 1993? Anyone know? Many of you would remember it. It's a really famous handshake. The Oslo Peace Accords, right? In 1993, signed on the White House lawn, brokered by, well, it happens in secret, but the United States takes credit for it. Even though it really didn't have a whole lot to do with it, but the U.S. is good at taking credit for things like that. So they, Bill Clinton facilitates the handshake between Yasser Arafat, who was the leader of the PLO, and Yitzhak Rabin, who was the Prime Minister of Israel. Now, one other thing that's really important that most people don't know. So I got into a debate the other day with someone who was saying, can we not just agree? He was on, if you want to put it in really simple terms, he was on one side of the debate and I was on the other, but that's not really very fair. We'll just put it that way for easy language. And he said, can we not just at least agree that the Palestinian leadership has never recognized Israel's existence? They've never recognized Israel's right to exist. And I said, unfortunately, no, we can't agree on that because it's not true. Many people believe that that's true, but it's not true. Historically, it's not. Because what happened was that in 1988, Jordan renounced its claim over the West Bank, because it had been holding on to that, right? It had been saying it had legitimate claim from 1949 until 1988, and said, you know what, we're giving it up, you know, it's Palestinian territory, you all can figure it out. Jordan gives up that claim, and then the Palestinian National Council agrees to a few things. The first is to recognize Israel's existence. Because until then, they hadn't been involved in any kind of peace negotiation. They'd been at war with Israel. Right? And if you're going to enter into a peace negotiation, you can only do that if you recognize the legitimacy of the person you're negotiating with in some way, right? So they recognized Israel's existence, stopped using language of the Zionist entity, which had been usually the language that was being used. We're at war with the Zionist entity, not Israel. They wouldn't use the language of Israel. Now they do. Israel exists. We accept all the UN resolutions since 1947. That's a big deal for the Palestinians. And here's the big one. We are giving up our claim to have all of the land, and we're now only asking for 22% of it. So they forswear their claim to 78% of the land. How many people knew that the Palestinians, as an official policy, are not claiming that they're entitled to the entirety of the land? How many people knew that? For 30 years, that's been the case. 30 years, and nobody knew that. Why? Right? That's so fascinating to me. Why are we not telling them? Because it's true. They said we've been fighting now for 40 years to get back everything that was given away or taken from us since the British were in control. And now we're saying, you know what? That's not going to happen. Just give us the West Bank and Gaza, which is 22% of the original piece of land.
Are you going to deal here or later with the nuance about existing as a Jewish state?
I wasn't going to do it because it's too nuanced, but I can do it.
That's all right.
Well, so what many Palestinians won't acknowledge is that Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state. They recognize that Israel itself exists and that it's going to continue to exist and they negotiate with it. But to acknowledge it as a Jewish state is complicated, and we don't have time to get into it now, but part of why it's complicated is because 20% of Israel's population is not Jewish. They're Arab, Palestinian, Christian, Muslims. So the question is, what does it mean to claim you have a Jewish state that's a democracy when 20% of your population isn't Jewish? So it's just a question to throw out there. That's part of why Palestinians would say we don't recognize the legitimacy of a Jewish state. We recognize the legitimacy and existence of Israel, but we don't think it should claim itself as a Jewish state. Not that the Jews shouldn't live there. It just shouldn't be identified as a Jewish state. It's an important nuance. And at this time, the Palestinians also proclaim that in their new state that they're declaring independence of at the moment, they should have East Jerusalem as their capital. Again, not all of Jerusalem. This is another huge misunderstanding people have. What people think is that the attention over Jerusalem is because Israel says that all of Jerusalem should be theirs, and the Palestinians say it should all be theirs. It's not true. Since 1988, when Palestinians have said we would like our own state, and just 22% of the land, what they've said is we will take East Jerusalem. So we'll split the city. Israel gets West Jerusalem, we get East Jerusalem. We share the city. That has been the Palestinian proposal. Now, what gets complicated for people is that the old city is part of East Jerusalem. And so that gets complicated in negotiations. So say you divide the city, and East Jerusalem is Palestinian, West Jerusalem is Israeli. What happens to the old city? Do the Palestinians get it?
And the old city is where all the holy places are.
Right.
Most of the holy places, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim, are in the old city.
There's no way we're going to get to talk about that. Unfortunately, we have 5 minutes left, and this hour flew by. We're going to skip. There's stuff on Hamas we don't have time to get into, but Hamas emerges in 1988 during the First Intifada, and it emerges specifically because it is in resistance to what I just told you about the Palestinian National Council. Hamas says we're not on board with that. We're not on board with the whole only 22% of the land. So Hamas becomes the Palestinian movement that says, no, we're still trying to get all of it. Now, Hamas has changed in its rhetoric in 30 years, which many people don't know. It's not necessarily changed in its tactics, but it's changed some in its rhetoric. But it emerges in opposition to the PLO's decision to give up claim to most of the land. Let's skip ahead. So the Oslo Peace Accords are signed, which are supposed to eventually result in a Palestinian state. It doesn't ever happen. And partly why it doesn't happen is because the land gets divided up even more than it already was. So we're going to zoom in here on the West Bank. This is where things get complicated, is that part of what happened at the Oslo Accords, again, which were supposed to establish a Palestinian state in peaceful coexistence with Israel, is that there would be divisions within the West Bank of what we call areas A, B, and C. What this meant was that Area A would be pieces of the West Bank that are within the full jurisdiction of the Palestinian Authority. The PLO at this time begins to be called the Palestinian Authority. So the leadership of Palestine has control over Areas A. What you see with Area A would be all of the big tan, or yellow, depending on what color you're seeing here, blocks, right up here, 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 and here. So it's the big cities, Hebron, Ramallah, Jericho, Bethlehem, Nablus, Calkilia, Tukar. All the big Palestinian cities would be Area A, meaning the Palestinian Authority has full municipal control and security control. Not military control, because Palestine has no army. It's just a police force. Area B would be areas that you see here in pink, which are kind of more populated but rural areas. So you have the heavily populated ones in the city, and then you have the areas that are a little more rural but still have some people in it. Those would be under the municipal control of the Palestinian Authority, but Israel has security control. So the Israeli military gets to be there, but they don't have governance in a sense. And in Area C, which is everything else that you see there, is under full Israeli control. So just think about that from a Palestinian perspective. Here you've gone to the negotiating table to have peace with Israel and to have your own state, and what you end up getting out of it is everything that you see in white belongs to Israel, and you are left to try to make a state in all of these little tan and pink pockets. How on earth can you do that? The answer is you can't, right? You can't make a cohesive state in a little island kind of thing like that when you're surrounded by what they would identify as a foreign military. How would you do it? So this has been the complication for Palestinians in trying to figure out how do we build a state, because they don't have any kind of cohesive state. And there are roads that dissect all of these little islands that are roads that are called settler-only roads, which means that they're only accessible to Israeli citizens. Palestinians are forbidden to use them. So I have maps I'm not going to be able to show you of all the different complications of restrictions I got a few more slides. Tensions continue to rise right after the Oslo Accords. Settlement population increases. Palestinians are getting more and more frustrated. You have the construction of all those roads I just described, so that you end up having kind of what we see now is a continual loss of land for Palestinians. So you have what you have in green here from 1946, and it has moved all the way down to where it is now between the divisions of A, B, C, the settlers, the settlements, the roads, all that kind of stuff. That's been, and I put this up there because it looks similar to me. This is the map of Native American habitation of the United States. It's dwindled down to reservations. So, as tensions continue to rise, suicide bombings begin to increase at this time, and we get to the Second Intifada. So the second major uprising. This one affected my family because I was, in 2001 actually, my family was supposed to spend 6 months living in Jerusalem, and we couldn't because the Second Intifada started. This one is different than the first, in that it is marked primarily by suicide bombing. So the first one was civil disobedience, boycott, strikes, affect the economy. This one is blow up as much as you can, and led primarily by Hamas. Hamas wasn't as involved in the first Intifada. It's very much organizing the second. At this, in 2001, 2, and 3 were the highest years for suicide bombing. In some cases, you had 40 to 50 bombings a year. It's almost one a week. You imagine what that's like, especially for the parents of young kids, your kids are you can't hold them captive in your homes. You gotta let them ride the buses and go eat at their, pizza places and go to their coffee shops. And where were the very places that were getting targeted most often? Buses, pizza shops, coffee shops. And I have stories I can tell you about talking with Israelis one in particular, his daughter was blown up in a suicide bombing when she was 14. And it's a harrowing story. But this was a very real time of terror for Israelis. So what they began to do was build a wall. And we can call it, the most neutral way to describe it is the West Bank barrier. Some call it the security fence. Others call it the separation or apartheid wall. Now you might be wondering, how on earth could it be a fence and a wall? Like it's one or the other. Well, the answer is it is in fact both. So construction begins in 2002 at the height of suicide bombing. Intended to be built, you would think, along the border, or the armistice line, to keep Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza from being able to come into Israel and commit acts of terrorism. So, here are just a few pictures that I've taken. So this is in some places where you have a fence, usually in areas where there aren't as many people. But it's not a fence like a chain link fence that you would use to keep your neighbor's dog out. This would be a fence, it's the exact same type of fence that's used in American prisons. So it's razor wire, electrified. I mean, it's a fence that is successful usually in keeping things in or out. And other places, usually in the cities, around places like Ramallah, near Bethlehem, Jerusalem, you have an actual wall. So you can see me, this is me when I was 18. You can see how tall it is. So it's twice the size of the Berlin Wall. Here's another picture. See the wall. This is a Palestinian city on this side. This would be Israel on the other side. And you can see this long, long wall. So, that wall again, like I said, is twice the size of the Berlin Wall. But here's the real kicker for the wall. Oh, please tell me this is going to work. Anyway, it's so depressing. So,
There it is.
well, it's not, there's one slide ahead, but we'll have to work with that. No, just go ahead and go back. So, what you see in blue is what the path of the wall actually is, the barrier. Okay? I had a slide before that doesn't show the blue, so that I can move to the next one, and you can see all of a sudden this blue line appear. It helps make the point. But the point is this: if I can hold my hand steady, follow my red dot, and I'm going to trace the border, the only internationally recognized border between Israel and the West Bank. Okay? So it goes here, right up here, and it comes out here. This is the border. Look where the blue is. Here's the border. Here's the border. Look where the blue is. Here's the border. Look where the blue is. Here's the border. Look at the blue. Here's the border. Down here. So the actual path of the barrier is more than twice as long as the actual border. And 85% of that barrier is built inside the Palestinian territory. 85%. Now, you may, based on the history of it, you would want to make a claim, obviously, for security reasons, right? Height of suicide bombing 2002, wall goes up, suicide bombing goes down, we've got a security argument. And yet, the question is, if you were building a wall to protect your country, why did you need to build 85% of it inside the land of the people you're at war with? It would be like President Trump saying, I need to build a wall to keep immigrants from Mexico from coming in. And you may say, it's a great idea. But maybe you wouldn't be as thrilled with the project if the wall went in and around Mexico City and Juarez and then came back around. What you would begin to ask yourself, I would hope, is, are we really building a wall to keep Mexican immigrants from coming in? Or are we using the excuse of keeping immigrants from coming in as a way to take more land? Because that's the question that's raised by the actual path of the wall. Are we building the wall for security reasons? Or, and it may be an and, but are we doing it for security reasons, or are we saying we're doing it for security reasons so that we can take the land? Because what ends up happening is that these pieces here, where you can see the blue really going deep, these are where the biggest settlements are. The ones that have 50, 60,000 people. So essentially what the wall does is it moves from Israel and it goes into the Palestinian territory and it grabs the big Israeli cities that are built in the West Bank and it brings them back onto the Israeli side of the border. I have a hard time saying that that's not a land grab. I don't know how you make a different case. You can say it's also about security. Sure. But how is it not also taking more land? Because you can see what the actual path of it is. You may say it's legitimate to take land, but it would still be taking land. So that's the complication with the issue of borders, which is one of the other final status issues. And I know that we're out of time. I was getting close to. Should I jump ahead and do anything on Jerusalem, or do we need to be done? What do you think, Dave?
I could do Jerusalem starting next week.
Time? Okay.
You want to say something about water?
We're going to be done. So the last two that I was just going to tell you about that I won't do now is just to say, of the 5 final status issues, we just talked refugees, settlements, and then this complication of borders. Are we going to have the border based on the green line and 67 borders, or is it going to be based on the wall and the fence? And the issue of water is just the simple fact that the vast majority of the water that is in the region lies within the territory of the West Bank, but Israel has control of almost all of it. So it's a complication of, in a two-state solution, who would get control of the water? Would it be Palestinians? Because most of it resides within Palestine, West Bank. Or would Israel get it? How would they share it? What's going to happen with it? So at the moment, Israel has control of almost all of it. And then the issue of Jerusalem, which is Israel's position has been Jerusalem is going to be our undivided capital, which is now what the United States has said they agree with. Palestinians have said, we want East Jerusalem as part of our capital. And until Donald Trump's decision, the rest of the world had said, Jerusalem is to be negotiated, and until then it's to be determined a neutral space, an international city that belongs to no one and to everyone. So Rob can come back next week and talk about the complications with Jerusalem. I'm sorry we had no time for questions. We got a little bit delayed at the beginning, but I'm happy to answer any questions if you have them now that we're done. But thank you for sitting through that very long and tedious lecture, and hope it was useful. And we'll see you next time. I actually won't be with you next time, so this is the last time I'll see you. But thanks for being here.